Imagine this: Paolo Maldini, Kaká, Andrea Pirlo, David Beckham, Ronaldinho, Alessandro Nesta, Gianluca Zambrotta, Clarence Seedorf, Filippo Inzaghi, Alexandre Pato, and Dida. Now, picture these legends and more all on the same team, managed by the greatest Champions League manager of all time. You don't have to imagine it. This actually happened. AC Milan were once the golden standard of not just Italy, but all of Europe. Silky smooth defense, line-breaking wizardry in the midfield, and unapologetic ruthlessness in attack. Carlo Ancelotti, arguably the greatest football manager of all time, depending on how you measure success, received the baton from all of the great managers that came before him and ran an unbelievable race. His Milan acted as a perfect representation of why experience matters on the biggest stage and why form is temporary but class is everlasting. Only 3 Milan players that started the 2007 Champions League final were under the age of 30. Although, perhaps the legacy of this era would be more solidified had accusations of corruption and match manipulation not circled around the team during one of the most controversial scandals in Italian football. For that reason and more, there is an opinion that despite all of the success that Ancelotti had with I Rossoneri, given the personnel he was blessed with, he did not achieve all that he could. There is truth to this, which we'll be covering in detail, but not everything is as black and white as it may first appear. Today, we dive deep. Today, we look into the fascinating tale of Carlo Ancelotti's AC Milan, the feared yet inconsistent kings of Europe. In the late 80s and early 90s, AC Milan stood at the summit of European football. Under Arrigo Sacchi and then Fabio Capello, they dominated with an invincible aura. 3 Champions Leagues and 5 league titles in the 9 years between 1987 and 1996. This near unstoppable aura began to fade. Capello departed in 1996 after finishing on a high note and securing another Scudetto, but with that departure, an air of uncertainty crept over a club accustomed to stability and success. In Capello's wake, Milan entered manager roulette. 10 managers, both permanent and interim, stepped into the hot seat, with all senses of consistency being off the table. First up was Oscar Tabarez in the summer of '96. The Uruguayan struggled to control a squad in transition, losing the plot almost immediately, sacked on the 1st of December. Happy holidays, buddy. Next was Arrigo Sacchi, the revered architect of Milan's late 80s glory. Fresh off the Italian national team job, he returned as caretaker to steady the ship. Yet, even Sacchi's aura couldn't stop the slide. Milan crashed out of the Champions League with a home loss to Rosenborg. Key players were past their peak. Franco Baresi was 36, Paolo Maldini was carrying injuries, and Demetrio Albertini's fitness was always in question. Stars were more focused on individuality than the team, Roberto Baggio, George Weah included. Serie A clubs had progressed tactically, yet Milan failed to keep up. All of this resulted in an 11th place finish, narrowly avoiding relegation by a merely 5 points. 1 year after being kings of Italy, 2 after being kings of Europe. The club's worst finish in 15 years. And if that wasn't enough, Baresi's retirement signaled the end of an era. I regret returning to Milan. Sometimes you should not go back to places where you have already achieved so much. The conditions were not right, and it was not the same as before. Sacchi said this years later. For the 97-98 season, Fabio Capello was lured back after a brief stint at Real Madrid. Like his predecessor, Capello's second spell was equally bleak. High-quality signings like Patrick Kluivert and Leonardo did not produce the intended results. 10th place. So, here we have the 2 managers that orchestrated the most successful period in the history of Milan, both leading the club to its worst finish since before each of them took over the club in the first place, in back-to-back seasons no less. I returned to a team that was not the one I built. I was sorry when they fired me. Words of Capello upon his second departure. But there was a flicker of hope at the end of the tunnel. Fresh off some very impressive years with Udinese, Alberto Zaccheroni stepped in and introduced a bold three-at-the-back formation, and his impact was immediate. Milan went straight back to the top. But as you've guessed by now, consistency, it was a real problem. A third-place finish in 2000 gave way to a collapse in 2001, sixth. Before the end of that year, Zaccheroni was dismissed and in came Cesare Maldini as a caretaker. And what was quite touching about this was that his son, Paolo, was the captain of the club by this point, an honor that was once bestowed upon him. But that was just about the only thing good that was happening. What followed was a trophyless season for the second year running. Fatih Terim was chosen as the latest savior. Nicknamed the Turkish Emperor, he arrived in the summer of 2001 from Fiorentina. Milan were determined to give him a fighting chance, so Rui Costa followed him from Fiorentina and signed for a club record fee of around 43 million euros at the time. Poacher Filippo Inzaghi and a 21-year-old attacking midfielder Andrea Pirlo followed up. Yet, this was not enough. By week 9 of the season, Terim was in trouble. Scrounging for hope, Inzaghi misses a last-minute penalty that would have drew Milan level against newly promoted Torino. The game ends with a 1-0 loss, and Terim is canned immediately. Throughout this turbulence, one thing remained consistent: Silvio Berlusconi, the flamboyant club owner and former Italian minister, was never far from Milan's bench. He publicly called out coaches over tactics and star selections. He was a man who demanded both style and substance, which makes it all the more understandable that he was about to make one of his most bold and fateful decisions. So, in November of 2001, the club turned to a familiar face in hopes of recapturing its soul. On the 5th of November 2001, Milan announced Carlo Ancelotti as head coach, the start of a new chapter. He was the fourth manager that same year, proof of Milan's instability. But fans were hopeful as this was a homecoming. Once a midfield general for Milan's legendary late 80s squad, a stalwart of Arrigo Sacchi's immortal team that won back-to-back European Cups in 1989 and 1990, Ancelotti's connection to the club ran deep. Once a leader on the pitch at the San Siro, now aged 42, he was tasked with doing so from the dugout. Having said that, his managerial journey to this point was marked by promise and pain. First came the promise with Reggiana, where he earned promotion from Serie B, then at Parma, where he built a vibrant young team that finished Serie A runners-up in 1997. Then came the pain. His early success led to the high-pressure job at Juventus in 1999. There, he twice came agonizingly close to glory, finishing Serie A second in 2000, losing the title on a rainy final day in Perugia, and again in 2001 by a mere 2 points. Each near miss at Juve, given the stature of the club, was a bruise to his fledgling managerial reputation. And the embarrassing manner that he was let go by Juve probably didn't do wonders for his confidence. Sacked at half-time of the final game of the season, even though the club still technically had a chance of winning the league if results went their way elsewhere. It seems fitting that, along with this disappointment, Ancelotti had to learn many lessons the hard way before becoming the manager we know him to be. Carlo Ancelotti's early coaching career was marred with the sense that he was not very tactically flexible. There was a famous story about how, when he was managing Parma, Roberto Baggio wanted to join the club. The deal was basically done. However, Ancelotti was a complete and total disciple of the 4-4-2, a system he thrived in as a player under Arrigo Sacchi. He felt there was no other way to play football. Roberto Baggio was a classic 10, and if you didn't know, there is typically no real free attacking role in a traditional 4-4-2 setup. Ancelotti told Baggio, widely believed to be the greatest Italian player of all time, by the way, that he either needed to play as a striker or hit the road. He hit the road. That year, Baggio scored 25 goals for Bologna. I lost 25 goals. Big mistake. Some regretful words by Ancelotti himself. But it was episodes like this that forced the man to rethink his rigid approach and adopt more of a player-centric approach. It was only later when he was at Juventus that Zinedine Zidane taught him the value of building around a special player. Fast forward to 2016, and in his autobiography, Quiet Leadership, when referring to a disagreement that he had with Cristiano Ronaldo in 2014 at Real Madrid, just before he won La Decima, he writes, "Who am I to argue? How can I change the position of a player who scores 60 goals a season? So I had to find a solution. The growth is evident." And I would say that it's a pretty good thing that Carlo Ancelotti had this revelation regarding how to deal with individuals before he arrived in Milan as a coach, because the following is the squad that he had at his disposal upon that arrival. We've already mentioned the creative Rui Costa, the clinical Inzaghi, and the soon-to-be iconic metronome in Andrea Pirlo. Andrei Shevchenko was in his prime, having scored 24 goals in each of his first 2 Serie A seasons with the club. Everything around him may have been up and down and inconsistent, but not him. Club captain Paolo Maldini anchored the defense with timeless class, flanked by veteran Alessandro Costacurta. Gennaro Gattuso, still only 23, had just become a nailed-on starter for the club in the past year. Still, the task was daunting. Milan were lying 5th in the league when Ancelotti took over. Not a crisis, but far below the club's lofty standards. First up on the agenda was tightening a leaky defense and restoring confidence in underperforming stars. Through the rest of the 2001-02 season, Milan found consistency, fighting their way up to a 4th place finish, securing Champions League spots on the final day. It wasn't always pretty, but it was effective. In Europe, he guided Milan to the UEFA Cup semi-finals, but were undone by Borussia Dortmund. Even though Milan fell short of the final, the run hinted at the competitiveness that Ancelotti was instilling. Off the pitch, the manager's demeanor brought an overwhelming sense of calm. Where some previous coaches clashed with Milan's management, Ancelotti built bridges. His famous eyebrow arched when under pressure, and everything just seemed to work itself out. Most importantly, his willingness to adapt tactically earned Berlusconi's trust. As a former Milan midfielder, he knew what the fans in the Curva Sud wanted, because he had stood there himself. Now, it was time to get to work. When the 2002 summer transfer window opened, Milan's ambition kicked into overdrive. They were determined to arm Ancelotti with a squad capable of conquering Europe once again. Fresh off World Cup triumph with Brazil, Rivaldo joined on a free transfer after falling out at Barcelona. From Lazio came Alessandro Nesta, Italy's finest defender at the time, for a colossal €31 million fee. In a swap deal with Inter, Dutch midfielder Clarence Seedorf joined up. Dida, the Brazilian goalkeeper, was purchased from Corinthians and immediately put out on loan a year prior, but rather quickly, he was deemed to be ready. Suddenly, with a mixture of youth and experience, the coach had the pieces to form a formidable unit. In 02-03, Ancelotti's first full season, Milan rediscovered their swagger. The coach fashioned a flexible 4-4-2 diamond, often also referred to as a 4-3-1-2. This became his trademark. In Serie A, Milan started strong, and by the midway point were even sat at the top of the table. But as the season progressed, the priorities of the team were evidently beginning to shift, something that would happen quite a lot over his tenure. The team ultimately finished in 3rd, as Ancelotti and his boys had their eyes on silverware of a different kind. They picked up their first Coppa Italia in 26 years. Interestingly, not a competition they win all that much. In fact, at the time of recording, they haven't won it since. Roma fell victim to them this time, 6-3 on aggregate over 2 legs. Milan hadn't lifted the European Cup in 9 years by this point, and unlike the Coppa Italia, at the time, that was a very, very long time for them. Now, they sensed destiny. For lack of a better description, this campaign was the definition of efficiency by Ancelotti. They did what needed to be done, and nothing more, at almost every stage. I'm sure the fans would have preferred a cleaner route, but that's not what football is about, is it? First up, as they finished 4th the year before, they had to go through qualifying rounds to make the actual tournament. A narrow 2-2 aggregate draw against Czech side Slovan Liberec. Slovan have never qualified for the Champions League to date. and it was only the away goal rule that stood between Milan and misery in that tie. When people speak about football being a game of inches, this is what they mean. In the first round of group stages, Milan were drawn against Bayern Munich, Deportivo La Coruña, and Lens. It was a table-topping round where they defeated Bayern back-to-back. Filippo Inzaghi was to blame from a Bayern Munich perspective. In fact, he was a menace all the way through. 8 goals in 4 matches in the first stage. Second round was Real Madrid, Borussia Dortmund, and Lokomotiv Moscow. Another table-topping performance. In both stages, as soon as the points were secured, star players were rested because what's the point of risking injury? As I said, efficiency was the name of the game. From then on, things got tricky. Ajax in the quarterfinals, a youthful Dutch side that had impressed many. First leg was tense, but no budging either way. Second leg, also tense. Milan led for most of the game at home, but the Ajax attack was formidable, equalizing at every step. By the 90th minute, the score was 2-2, and Ajax were moments from going through on away goals, only for John Thomasson to pop up in the 91st minute with a winner. That goal was everything. The feeling amongst the fans was that they were about to go all the way, but at the very least, they would not have to travel too far. Inter Milan in the semi-finals. The Derby della Madonnina, an unprecedented all-Milan affair on the continental stage. The tension over 2 legs was palpable. In the first leg, technically away at the San Siro, AC Milan were held 0-0 by a defensive Inter. In the return leg, with AC Milan as hosts, quote-unquote, I Rossoneri struck first, Shevchenko clinically finishing just before half-time. Inter pushed back and equalized through Obafemi Martins, but crucially, AC Milan held on to go through on away goals. Can you imagine being knocked out on away goals while playing in your own stadium? That right there, that is very tough. Captain Paolo Maldini, 34 years old and as determined as ever, would now follow in his father's footsteps by leading his beloved club out as captain in a European Cup final. Bear in mind, the man had been in the club since the mid-80s and already had 6 Serie A titles and 3 Champions League trophies to his name. But this edition was special. The energy around the club in this new era was palpable. Granted, they couldn't get too far ahead of themselves because to seal their name in history, a familiar presence stood in their way. Familiar in more ways than one. Juventus, technically the best team in Italy with the Scudetto to prove it. The same team that had let Carlo Ancelotti go only 2 years prior. In the first ever all-Italian Champions League final, AC Milan faced a daunting Marcelo Lippi-led Juventus. It was a clash of heavyweights and a tactical chess match from the start. Juventus were missing their centerpiece, Pavel Nedved, that year's Ballon d'Or winner, through a suspension and played slightly more cautiously than usual. But then again, both sides were on the cautious side. Nothing could break the deadlock in 120 minutes of playing time, so it all came down to penalties. It was a shootout where nerves were rampant and goalkeepers reigned supreme. 5 shots stopped in total as Gianluigi Buffon and Dida made a star-studded lineup on either side lose their calm. Dida emerged on top though. 3 saves as Milan took the final with 3 goals to 2. Andrei Shevchenko stepped up and coolly slot the decisive penalty past Buffon. My goodness, look at how far off his line Dida is over here. You can tell this is retro. Milan were back. Carlo Ancelotti had delivered the ultimate prize as manager, including the Coppa Italia. But beyond the trophies, Ancelotti had forged something even more lasting, an identity. Tactically, he evolved Milan into a side that could adapt formations fluidly, from the classic 4-1-2-1-2 with a playmaker to a 4-3-2-1 quote-unquote Christmas tree that he would later use, which maximized creative attackers without adversely impacting defensive structure. You could sleep easy knowing Paolo Maldini and Alessandro Nesta were guarding your goal. Andrea Pirlo had completed his conversion from an attacking midfielder into a deep-lying playmaker and blossomed, spraying passes from deep and dictating tempo in a way Italian football hadn't seen in ages. and arguably hasn't seen since. Gattuso was the bulldog that made sure Pirlo could do so, protecting him and chasing down every ball. Clarence Seedorf added a mixture of the two, but most importantly, composure. Rui Costa was the silky smooth 10, one of the last of a dying breed. Inzaghi and Shevchenko thrived on the service and the space this midfield afforded. Above all else, Ancelotti's man management was perhaps his greatest strength. He knew how to handle big egos and aging legends alike, gently phased out veterans when needed, and gave confidence to younger players. As Paolo Maldini once put it, Ancelotti manages to make every player feel important. Maldini was clearly onto something. There's a reason that even to this day, he maintains an image of someone that players universally love and respect. Perhaps apart from his time managing Bayern Munich years later, but we'll save that for another video. Ancelotti was also not afraid to make bold decisions, like often benching Rivaldo despite his star status. Rivaldo, who had won the Ballon d'Or only a few years prior. Ironically, the reason he left Barcelona in the first place was due to Louis van Gaal not believing he was delivering at club level the same way he did for Brazil. In a year where Milan won a stunning double, Rivaldo won the Bidoni d'Oro, an award given to the worst player in Serie A. Any guesses how Louis van Gaal was feeling after that? Ancelotti was also not afraid to swiftly swap out fan favorite Rui Costa for a young, relatively unknown Brazilian playmaker. To be fair, looking back, this was not that much of a gamble. Ricardo Kaká, a 21-year-old attacking midfielder signed from Sao Paulo for 8.5 million euros. Berlusconi once described this fee as peanuts, despite the fact that many in Europe had never even heard of the guy, and the fact that 8.5 million euros was actually quite a lot of money back then, in football terms at the very least. He was right. From the moment Kaká donned the red and black, it was evident Milan had struck gold. Blessed with blistering pace, silky dribbling, and deadly precision for goal. Ancelotti, recognizing what he had in front of him, gave the youngster a starting role sooner than expected. And rather than causing discord, Rui Costa mentored Kaká, and the coaching team masterfully rotated these creative players to keep everyone happy. The transition was seamless. This is why Milan succeeded. Nowadays, the youth call it the power of friendship, but honestly, that's a good description. This was the environment Ancelotti created. Brazilian right-back Cafu also signed in the summer of 03, 33 years old, but still one of the best fullbacks in the world and indeed the best of all time to many. Well worth it for the experience alone. Also, he was free, the best price. In 2003-04, Milan reached the pinnacle of Ancelotti's reign domestically. They stormed to the Serie A title, collecting 82 points in 34 matches, the club's highest points tally ever in a 3 points per win season at the time. 11 points separated them from second-placed Roma. Shevchenko was capocannoniere, or top goalscorer, with 24 league goals, once again, often fed by Kaká's assists and Pirlo's vision. The team was perfection and was right in the middle of a perfect storm. The majority of the players were in their mid to late 20s, slap bang in their physical and mental primes. Many were of the opinion that a domestic and European dynasty was on the cards. Yet, fate had other plans. Milan would remain a powerhouse for the years to come, but curiously failed to win any domestic silverware from then on. None whatsoever. The summer of 2004 brought further reinforcements: Dutch hardman Jaap Stam and Argentine hitman Hernan Crespo. Ancelotti's Milan battled Juventus neck and neck in Serie A through 2004-05, but it was never enough. They would be runners-up again in 05-06, and then, in the Ancelotti era at the very least, never challenge for the title again. The reasons were aplenty: aging key players, point deductions, which we'll get to in a bit, Fabio Capello's Juventus, kind of, we'll get to that too, and the resurgence of Inter Milan. But even though they ceded the Italian throne, they still ruled on European nights, where their experience and pedigree made them the team everyone feared to draw. This was proven yet again in the 2005 Champions League campaign. Manchester United, Inter Milan, again, and then PSV all fell as they marched on to yet another Champions League final, the Ataturk Olympic Stadium in Istanbul. The match has since passed into football folklore as the greatest final in Champions League history. From a Milan perspective, for all the wrong reasons. The lineup Carlo Ancelotti selected was the hands-down favourite. Liverpool are a massive football club, but they were going through quite a rough patch, and even their route to the final was marred by many feeling they rode their luck a lot. Exhibit A is the infamous ghost goal scored in the semi-final versus Chelsea. Louis Garcia hits the ball towards goal and William Gallas clears the line, but there are no known camera angles that prove or disprove that this goal actually went over the line. Goal was given. Doesn't really matter how you felt about Liverpool's route to that final. This is what knockout football is all about at the end of the day, and Milan rode their luck at times too. All the same, when the final came around, the first 45 minutes were just as most people expected. Absolute brilliance from I Rossoneri. One of the finest displays ever seen over 45 minutes in a European final. Maldini volleyed Milan ahead after 50 seconds, and Crespo added another 2 goals before halftime to make it 3-0. By halftime, most thought the game was over and that all that was left was training drills for Milan. Well,
is accomplished.
We had 6 minutes of madness in which we threw away everything we'd worked for until then. Words of Ancelotti. In one of the most surreal turnarounds in sports history, Liverpool scored 3 goals in 6 minutes just after the break to level the final 3-3. A shell-shocked Milan tried to rebound, but all they could do was watch, devastated, as Liverpool completed the comeback, winning the penalty shootout. For Ancelotti and his men, it was a nightmare. Shevchenko was inconsolable. 2 years before, it was him that scored the goal that won the trophy in a penalty shootout. This time, it was his miss that sealed Milan's fate. Italian football, however, was still in a very strong period. Teams were reaching European finals. The national team won the 2006 World Cup. Things were looking good. Until they weren't. You know where this is going. Calciopoli in 2006. The referee match manipulation scandal. The gist of this scandal was that referees were reportedly being influenced and bribed by leading Italian football officials to give favorable calls to certain teams, giving 50-50s one way, carding important players before big matches, and so on and so forth. The main perpetrators were widely seen to be Juventus and their prominent managing director, Luciano Moggi. For their actions, the club was punished heavily, relegated to the lower divisions and stripped of their 2005-06 league titles. You might be thinking that Milan felt vindicated perhaps, that they were victims of corruption. They were the runners-up in those 2 years after all. Well, you'd be wrong. They were implicated too. In a series of telephone wiretaps, Milan officials were heard attempting to influence linesmen assigned for their matches. Compared to Juventus, the operation was mild, but they certainly weren't innocent, or, at the very least, weren't deemed to be innocent. 30-point deduction from the 05-06 tally. The original table from that season had Juventus up top with 91 points, Milan in second with 88, Fiorentina, Inter, Roma and Lazio making up the remaining top 6. But after punishments were handed out, only Inter and Roma were left standing with no deductions. I should note that no Milan players or players from any of the teams that were implicated or managers from any of the teams that were implicated were found to have any involvement. For every organization, it seemed to be a matter of rogue management. Milan were handed a further 8 points deduction prior to the start of the 06-07 season and were banned from European competition. However, only for a moment. They were eventually allowed to compete in the Champions League, but only from the qualifying rounds, which made what happened next all the more controversial. The league was always going to be out of their grasp thanks to the 8-point penalty. But even if it weren't, I'm not entirely convinced that they would have been able to overhaul Inter Milan's 97-point season, especially considering that this was a record-breaking tally and the fact that Milan finished in 4th, 36 points adrift. An Inter consisting of Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Patrick Vieira, Adriano, Figo, Javier Zanetti, and many more, first managed by Roberto Mancini, and then Jose Mourinho, were truly too formidable. They gripped onto the Scudetto tightly for many years to come. For AC Milan, like I said, it was all about the cups. They made it to the semi-final of the Coppa Italia before being knocked out by Roma. No matter, the team was always ripe and ready for the competition that was nearest to their heart. The journey to the 2006-07 Champions League final was perhaps Ancelotti's magnum opus. A masterclass of knockout football, truly. The spine of the squad remained similar to the previous title-winning teams, with some notable inclusions: Alberto Gilardino and Johan Gourcuff, to name just two. A table-topping group stage that was again characterized by achieving qualification and then resting important players. In the round of 16, they faced Celtic, a tie that was possibly their trickiest of that year's campaign. For the longest time, everything Milan threw at the Scottish champions failed to work. 41 attempts on goal over the two legs versus 14 for Celtic, 0-0 in the first leg. And as the second leg was heading towards the same fate, enter the man himself, Ricardo Kaká. 93rd minute, Kaká picked up the ball near the midfield, ghosts past two defenders and slots home a banger solo goal. If it wasn't obvious to anyone by that point, it was now. This was about to be the year of Kaká. Quarterfinals, a reunion with Bayern Munich. The first leg at San Siro ended 2-2, a frustrating result after Milan led twice, only to concede a 90th minute equalizer. Some doubted Milan could survive the return in Munich, but those doubts served as fuel. At the Allianz Arena, Milan produced a masterclass. Clarence Seedorf was a man possessed, scoring a neatly struck low shot and creating another for Inzaghi within 4 minutes. What a beautiful assist. 4-2 on aggregate, silencing 60,000 Bavarians in their own backyard. The semi-final pitted Milan against Manchester United, a newly rebuilt Manchester United, boasting young Cristiano Ronaldo and Wayne Rooney, both approaching the peak of their powers. Simply put, the first leg of this tie was an all-time classic. The score sheet alone is enough to bulge eyeballs. 3-2 with all of Ronaldo, Rooney and Kaká taking part. Manchester United won the leg by the end of it, but the picture of this game etched into the minds of everyone that was fortunate enough to watch it live is of this man, Kaká, toying with the United defense, causing Gabriel Heinze and Patrice Evra to forget what day it was in confusion, smashing into each other as the star man walked the ball into the net for his second goal of the night. It was some subtle foreshadowing of what was to come in the reverse leg back in Italy. Utter and total domination. 3-0 at the San Siro with United standing no chance. So, in a season where Milan were supposed to be suffering from the actions of their superiors, they found themselves in yet another Champions League final. And I have yet to even mention the fact that this was an aging squad. They are what the youth of today would call UNC FC. The only players that started the Champions League final that season that were in their 20s were Gennaro Gattuso, 29, Andrea Pirlo, 28, and Kaká, 25. The rest were in their 30s. The way football is today, I don't know if we'll ever see anything like this again. And to add even further spice to the equation, the final was against Liverpool. 2 years on from Istanbul, it was time for revenge. Before the game, Ancelotti made sure everyone knew that his team were not the type to forget. We don't always get what we deserve in football, but we have another chance to take what we felt was ours. The final itself was maybe one of the best depictions of why experience matters so greatly in everything you do. As was the case in 2005, Milan were the better side on paper. They proved this further by taking the lead by half-time. Inzaghi, ever the predator, made it happen. And for the remainder of the game, Maldini and Nesta remained resolute and never lost focus. Clearly, the mistakes of the past were ever present within their minds. In the 82nd minute, Inzaghi did it again, rounding the keeper to seal the deal. Liverpool did score in the 88th minute, which threatened to trigger some PTSD, but it was not enough. Paolo Maldini, at 38, lifted his 5th European Cup, 18 years after he'd first done it. AC Milan's 7th overall, the Demons of Istanbul were truly exercised on that warm night in Athens. Kaká fell to his knees in prayer and Ancelotti flew in the opposite direction, tossed in the air by his team in celebration. The 2006-07 Champions League run cemented Kaká's status as the best player in the world. He was the tournament's top scorer with 10 goals and was rightly awarded the 2007 Ballon d'Or, the last man to win it before the Ronaldo and Messi duopoly of the title. However, every era, no matter how golden, must eventually dim. After 2007, Ancelotti's Milan had just about gone as far as they could. The squad was old, and the monumental shift in financial power of other leagues were now being felt in full force. In 2007-08, Milan were knocked out of the Champions League in the round of 16 and slumped to a 5th place finish, meaning they would not even feature in the following year's edition. Off the pitch, club owner Silvio Berlusconi, by then serving a second term as Italy's prime minister, had dialed back investment compared to the free spending of the 90s. There was a lot of talk of construction of a new stadium or major commercial deals, for the most part, none of which materialized. While all of this was happening, Milan still remained the fashionable team to support for non-Serie A watchers. One big reason was that the club saw a slew of extremely high-profile players walk through their gates. Ronaldo Nazario joined in 2007 but could not participate in the Champions League triumph as he was cup-tied, joining from Real Madrid midway through the year. By then, his body had consistently let him down over the years. Even still, he performed to a standard that really shouldn't have been possible. 20 appearances, 9 goals, and 4 assists for the club, followed by another knee injury before returning to Brazil to end his career. Ronaldinho entered the club in 2009, and some of the moments he produced were just magic. The flair, the goals. He was excellent when he wanted to be, but his partying habits, being seen at nightclubs until the early hours multiple times per week, would later lead to Milan not getting the best of him. David Beckham, the man himself, joined Milan on loan in early 2009 from LA Galaxy to maintain fitness in the MLS offseason. Past his prime, but still an elite ball striker and a top-drawer shirt seller. And for all the legends that came through, there was young talent to be excited about too. Alexandre Pato, a teenage forward signed from Internacional in Brazil in 2007. Pato had it all: pace, power, and killer instincts. He gave the fans hope. Thiago Silva, another young Brazilian centre-back signed in January 2009. Training with Maldini and Nesta turned him into a true warrior. Although he never actually played for the first team, a young Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang was steadily developing in the Milan academy. There was a whole lot to be excited by. Sadly, disappointment was also rampant in the moment. Carlo Ancelotti's time was drawing to a close. Throughout 2009, rumors swirled that he had an offer from Chelsea, whose owner Roman Abramovich coveted Ancelotti's European pedigree. The Champions League was the only thing Abramovich wanted, and our man over here was and still is the definitive specialist. Meanwhile, Berlusconi, never shy to voice his opinions, frequently second-guessed Ancelotti's tactics in public, as he did with all of his predecessors. Their relationship, however, did remain respectful, but the wear and tear over the years showed. After Milan's final game of the 08-09 season, a 2-0 win at Fiorentina that clinched 3rd place, Ancelotti announced that he would be leaving the club by mutual agreement. He departed as the longest-serving coach of the Berlusconi era, 8 years in total. The summer of 2009 was truly filled with watershed moments. Not only did Ancelotti exit, but AC Milan also said goodbye to the greatest captain in its history, Paolo Maldini. At 40 years old and after 25 seasons with the senior team, Maldini hung up his boots. Kaká, the golden boy of Milan and Ballon d'Or winner in 2007, was sold to Real Madrid in June of 2009 for 68 million euros. The transfer was a hard pill to swallow, but the finances were too compelling to turn down. It seems that both the team and the player would have hoped that this ended differently. Kaká himself is on record saying that the reason he left was to help Milan balance their sheets. So, Just like that, the era of Ancelotti came to a close. Now we return to the assertion from the very start of this discussion, the common opinion that with such a constellation of talent, Ancelotti's Milan underachieved. Realistically, this is an opinion that is hard to argue against, but context is key. In Italy, they faced one of the strongest teams to ever exist in European football in Juventus, a team that, in all honesty, didn't need to cheat to win. They then faced, likewise, another all-time European team in Inter Milan. In Europe, they dueled with the Galacticos of Real Madrid and the emerging financial dynasties of English football. Through it all, Milan remained consistently among the elite. If anything, their focus on Europe, a competition that suited the slow, methodical brutality of their veteran squad, meant they often had to ease off in the grueling marathon of Serie A. As Ancelotti said in later years, Milan had become like a family, an older family. Perhaps we had more energy for Tuesday and Wednesday nights than for the weekend. Not gonna lie, that's actually quite funny. Above all, Ancelotti's Milan were feared and revered. Should they have achieved more? Perhaps. But nobody can take away the long-lasting impact this team has had on the footballing world. The countless edits that are posted on social media just of the lineups from this era. The true emergence of Carlo Ancelotti as a football manager that is not to be second-guessed. So, this one goes out to Carlo Ancelotti's AC Milan, the dynasty that should have been.